everyone. Molly, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. As Molly mentioned, my name is Rachel Ossip, and I am the deputy editor here at Triple Canopy. Thank you all so much for being here on this gloomy Saturday, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in on the live stream. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon and spend some time with two critics who I unironically consider to be voices of their generation in their respective fields, Andrea Long-Chu and Rachel Hunter-Himes. Andrea Long-Chu is a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic at New York Magazine, and while many may know Andrea as a literary critic, she has not only written about the work of Sally Rooney and Zadie Smith, but also about Phantom of the Opera, Yellow Jackets, Sex and the City, and of course, Dungeons and Dragons. Her most recent book, Authority, appeared earlier this year, and Authority collects not only Andrea's criticism from the past 7 or so years, but also features 2 new essays, The Eponymous Authority and Criticism in a Crisis, in which Andrea addresses criticism itself and the role of the critic head-on. Rachel Hunter-Himes is a museum worker, critic, and scholar who's currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and she's researching representations of race in the material culture and decorative arts of 18th and 19th century Europe. Her writing on art in museums, covering the likes of Lorna Smith and Kara Walker, the Met's show on the Harlem Renaissance, and feminist chinoiserie, yes, as well as analyzing why so much protest happens at museums, has appeared in The Nation and Plus One and Jacobin, and most relevantly for us today is forthcoming in Triple Canopy. The piece that Rachel is working on for Triple Canopy, which will be out in our next issue in about a month, is part of this forthcoming issue on holes, and it charts out a history and present of criticism in which critics, usually but not always white critics, have a particular difficulty assessing Black art, largely because they refuse to move beyond easy and often damaging assumptions. We'll get more into this topic as we talk. In Authority, Andrea writes that we ask the critic for the ability to make the work of art intelligible while preserving its integrity. A true critic, Andrea clarifies, does not offer their opinion simply. They offer judgment. In many cases, this is not at all what actually happens. In fact, sometimes critics do precisely the opposite. They make a work of art more distant, less intelligible, and less approachable. The title of this conversation is Bad Criticism, and that's what we mean. We're not talking about negative criticism, which can make a work more intelligible, but bad criticism, which is criticism that fails in some way or in many ways to open up a work to the public. In many cases, negative criticism is, in fact, good criticism. It can disparage a work, but also clearly articulate its merits and failures, give a reader or a viewer context that expands the work, and clearly conveys an encounter with the work, one that leaves the critic wanting to, the reader or viewer wanting to engage further. Bad criticism, instead, fails to engage in good faith with its object, and it can even do so by being overly positive, by being sycophantic and saccharine, as well as potentially being disparaging. Today, we're here to discuss the various ways in which bad criticism happens and perhaps suss out some of the culprits of why it happens. Rachel has considered this line of thinking once before, publicly in a talk with Jeremy Toussaint-Baptiste last fall, organized by Ethan Philbrook at the Poetry Project. And I just want to briefly shout out Ethan's original work for hosting that conversation and getting the discourse going. We've had many, many conversations since that have brought us back to the stage this year. So I'm going to jump in with some questions for Rachel and Andrea to get the conversation going. We'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up things to all of you. So if you have questions, keep them in mind for that moment. So I think we should start by setting some expectations. This is both a basic and a difficult, annoying, detailed question, one that Andrea, the quote that I mentioned from Authority, answers somewhat. But what is good criticism if we're going to talk about bad criticism? What is the critic's job? You cover most of this in your in Authority, in the essay called Authority within Authority, as well as in Criticism and Crisis, and I don't want to get super in the weeds, because we could probably spend this whole time talking about good criticism and then we'd never get to the bad criticism. But to lay the ground, we should talk a little bit about that first. So maybe the easiest way to actually get into that is, what do you try to do in your own criticism, or what are you aspiring towards when you are writing criticism?
Yeah, this is so long. I'm going to be hunching the whole time. Let me change that. So I think my answer is a little bit twofold, which is the question of good criticism is sort of a historical one, in the sense of like, criticism has always been really invested in the idea of there being good and bad criticism, and I myself am pretty skeptical of that division. I think it's doing ideological work, and I write about that some in that essay in Authority. And sort of protecting the endeavor of criticism from outside forces. And I tend to be against that kind of good criticism. Here, I mean, you could substitute for good, you could substitute what's a nice word, decent or sort of upright criticism. Criticism the way it is supposed to be performed, proper criticism. And the kind of criticism that I do is not that. And I know this because I have been told it by people who I'm sure would know. And so, good criticism, proper criticism is is contemplative. You're contemplating the object. You're trying to account for its merits according to certain laws of the form, which are beautiful because they're beautiful, and to inquire past that. To inquire past the question of beauty is to start to commit errors, to say, well, it's because this book is, because whatever, this book is promoting socialism, and so it's good, or because, the author is a devout Christian, and so it's good, or whatever, right? Bringing in outside things is generally considered bad. That kind of bad I am for, and that kind of bad is the kind of thing that I would consider good, in the sense of at least being interesting to me, and I think also being of greater use. So what I try to do, as I say in the book, is I think the artist's job is to some extent to take something out of the world, and the critic's job is to put it back in. And so I do care about the people. I care about who edited the book, and I care about where ideas actually came from, and I care about, I feel like I'm often doing that kind of investigative work, and sometimes, and maybe they are right. Sometimes people say this makes it not real criticism. Even the Pulitzer Committee was like, the pieces are about like authors or something, books and their authors or something like that. There's a certain amount of trepidation, but so that would be my answer, is that I try to do the kind of criticism that is most interesting to me is the kind that tries to slip the bonds of kind of good criticism as traditionally practiced. It doesn't mean that I think that there's no such thing as bad criticism. I think there's definitely such thing as bad criticism, but I'm always a little wary, because I think the term can move around between different spaces. And be used to moralize, or to lay down certain boundaries that I would prefer to trouble. But I would say I like to think of myself as someone who is intentionally writing bad criticism.
What about you, Rachel? Are you intentionally writing bad criticism?
I would say no, but maybe unintentionally. For me, I think what I think good criticism does is kind of forge or clear a path between an audience, a person, and the object of criticism. I think, Andrea, you say the object should be returned to the world. I think that's an important part of clearing a path, especially when it comes to works of art. Works of art kind of have a quasi-mythical, mystical status. They're mystified. One of the ways the work of art is mystified is when it's called a masterpiece, or when a certain received sense of who its creator is obfuscates the work. So I think the critic has to kind of clear some of that away, and I think that means returning the work to the world by identifying or suggesting some of the social forces or political forces that allowed the work of art to be, that placed it in front of you so that you could see it. These are, I think, clarifying practices that sort of clear the way for you to see an object without that sort of mystical obfuscation. I think the role of the artist actually is to kind of create the object as mystical, and the critic's job is to kind of pull the curtain aside in some ways, which means I think that criticism, and I think today we see criticism that maybe sees itself more as standing with the object and kind of facing the world together, criticism that kind of acts as an analog to the work of art, but that's not the kind of criticism that I like to see or like to do, I guess. So yeah, I think where the artist obfuscates, the critic reveals through historically informed analysis, socially informed analysis. So yeah, I think in some ways it sounds counterintuitive, but the criticism maybe in some ways leaves the realm of personal experience behind, because I think that can be left to the viewer, or at least I hope it can be, to the assisted viewer.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to express some agreement and say also, I think, just to be more specific, I think part of what we're talking about is what are considered kind of boundaries of what is and is not off limits, right? Are you allowed to, in a review of the most recent Rachel Cusk book, talk about how many pounds she sold her house for that was full of the sort of terrible art that her husband makes, right? Like there's a question, is that allowed or not? It's a real question. It's a very interesting question. And if it's not allowed, why? And that is maybe the thing that really animates me is from the point of view of like ideology analysis is why is it that would be off limits? Why is it that would be outside of the sphere of concern? Not even saying that it has to be in the sphere of concern, just that it is not an accident, nor is it obvious why that would be the case. And so a lot of the time we're talking about what can come into it, what can't come into it, and why. And those are very contentious things. There's a reason that you laugh, and it's not just because it's sort of a funny thing to imagine Rachel Cusk's house, but the reason, that release, right? That feeling of like, oh, now we're actually just talking about it, right? Like now we're like acknowledging that Rachel Cusk lives somewhere, and then that she moved. And now she's in Paris, where Thomas Chatterton Williams will do a profile of her, right? Like these are, that to me is, that's the interesting stuff, right? Like, and why does the Atlantic care that she lives in Paris now? And why does that's so interesting to me. Like that, and not because I'm not interested in the art, but because it's fascinating to me to allow those things to be connected and see what happens, right? Like you know, taking the governor off of the engine or something, and like seeing where it will actually, let the work of art be flooded by all of the reality around it, and like really interesting things happen.
I feel like there's a sense too, though, that these kinds of things can over-determine, and so there's almost like three different. We want to do like poles, right? On the one pole, we have the claim that none of the biography, none of the material considerations should come into the discussion, right? On the other pole, we have what Rachel has termed lifestyle criticism and what others call biographical criticism, right? Which is, as you put it, the subtle art of hanging out in lieu of actually reading or reading into a piece. And I feel like there's always this kind of complex dance of trying to figure out what the sweet spot is, like how much of the lives or the biography are relevant to the work, and how do you determine how much of that to include without falling into the trap of one pole or the other. Rachel, do you want to say any more about that in relation to the piece you've been working on?
Yeah, I mean, what I guess I'm thinking about as lifestyle criticism is just like, you see a lot of art critics, they go and hang out with the artists in their studio, they visit them at their house upstate. Instead of like writing an essay, they reproduce a conversation. And the person of the artist comes to figure really, really largely in the reception of their work. I think, for me, I can understand why this is happening. One, like we have a parasocial relationship to artists who are like kind of like celebrities for like some of us. And then two, we're in a content era, and so those types of writing make good content. I think three, historically, when it comes to Black artists, the critical record is really, really conditioned by some like major silencings of Black artists, or just the refusal to listen to them. So it makes sense that like today we've arrived at a criticism that really, really wants to let the artist speak. My primary research is about the 18th and 19th century, so like I'm really, really happy to not ever have to talk to an artist. I would really love to.
They should all be dead.
They should be dead. I mean, for me. But I think that there are problems when we position the artist as the foremost authority on their work. One, it creates kind of like a closed loop. It's like, okay, the work begins and ends with what the artist did and what they think about what they did, which is like, then why would we even bother to look at it? Why have a viewer if what the artist thinks about the work is like the be-all, end-all of what it is and what it can be? And then, yeah, I just feel like there's a replacement of the work with the artist. But I think this is a different thing than what Andrea is talking about, because I think you are saying like the work can be slotted into a constellation of relevant, we can say like facts or data. And I think the critic's job is to think about like, which facts and which data illuminate the object productively. And I think among those data points, certainly the fact that the artist is selling their house could have a relevance. It tells us a lot of stuff. It tells us about the way finance and art are engaging each other. It tells us about what kind of financial reception the work is receiving. So I think these are like subtle but different approaches. But the artist themselves would never say like, to understand my work, you need to know that I just bought a house. So that's stuff that the critic like gets to do, that the artist wouldn't advance as a viable data point in interpreting their work.
Well, exactly. Yeah. The reason, because I fully agree with you, and I know the kind of coverage that you're talking about, and it is increasing, and there are a couple different reasons for that. At least, I can speak to the literary situation a little bit more, but part of it is the nature of publishing, right? Like part of it is that there is a, you know, is that LitHub just has to keep publishing things, right? Like, and that's not a knock on LitHub, but it's like I've done interviews with LitHub, right? But it's the sort of the interview, you know, and kind of profile world is a thing that's, you know, it's happening not just on the critic end, it's also happening on the side of, you know, publicity teams at the publishing houses, and it's all part of a kind of ecosystem, and to some extent, as is often the case, liberalism is mad that capitalism is happening, right? Like, oh, how you're ruining our art by like making it, you know, by bringing in, you're making it so clear that this is a business and that commerce is happening, and right. So, you know, I think there's that aspect of it, but also, to your point, yes, I think there is a version of focusing on a person which is one can be because you're just trying to get them to you're focusing on them because you're not interested in the work, because the work is sort of, it's just the fact that the work exists, and it's because you're a black artist, or you're a trans writer, or you're a, you know, like whatever, that there's you're a certain kind of you know, content is being created, and so it's sort of indifferent. You fill the details so there can be enough words to publish it. But also, even in a sort of better faith version of that, like, you can't ask people are poor authorities about their own art because they're also poor authorities about themselves, right? Like, it is materialism to say, this person wrote this novel while they were on fellowship in Scotland. It is not really materialism to ask the person how Scotland was, right? Those are very different questions. You can, but then you should also be doing the first part, right? So, yeah, I think and that is getting to a kind of instability in what we mean by personal, right? That like, oh, it's too personal to do this. What we mean by the person in that case versus sometimes we mean the actual like person, but sometimes what we mean is like, oh, the kind of the conditions around the artist's work that are being hidden under the idea of the personal.
I feel like the far epitome of the lifestyle criticism is the Grub Street diet. I mean, not that anyone considers that criticism, but I'm sort of endlessly fascinated by that phenomenon, that people want to know what writers eat. I'm like, I don't want to know what writers eat. I want to know what writers write. But this is, again, like part of the machine. And I think it's important to, you know, criticism has a close but hypothetically distinct relationship to publicity, but those lines can get very blurry. And I'm curious to hear you both talk a little bit maybe about how that particular element differs a little bit between the literary world and the art world, potentially. This is all conjecture. We're not going to have truths on this because obviously Andrea and Rachel are only representing specific arenas of both the art and the literary world. So we're trying not to generalize too broadly, but.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like many people's experience of art world writing is, you know, it's tough. Like, some of the best paid writing opportunities might be to promote a show happening at a gallery. It's a good gig, or to you know, celebrate an artist who it's been, you know, decided that they need to be celebrated. I think a lot of critics.
It's been decided.
I think a lot of critics feel a real obligation to artists, because like, it's obviously very hard to be an artist. Like, I would never want to do that. So, like, you know, they don't want to like ruin these people's lives, and the way that they don't want to do that is by giving them a bad review. Even though I think that, you know, maybe we're past the moment where, like, you know, all press is good press. I think it damns the critic and it damns the artist if they write a bad review of of a show. So I think there's just, particularities in the art world about, when can you get paid to do something that make the terrain tough to write in. I think also because there's so little art writing being published in sort of mainstream magazines, newspapers, that, at least I feel sometimes it's like, I would not want to subject the public to like the inside baseball of a review that, eviscerates its subjects. Like if a person is only going to read maybe one essay about art a month, I kind of want to present them with something that is good, that like I would want you to see this art. Like I would want you to have this art in your life. I'd like to give the person who's only going to read one art essay a month like that essay, and maybe not an essay that's like, I don't think you should bother seeing this, or like I don't think this would be worth your time. So I think those are kind of some of the situations.
Can you say a little bit more, though? I think in the piece you're working on for us, you talk about what the negatives of that bias end up doing for an artist, the art world, critical relationships, though. Could you say a little bit more about when we have this narrow funnel and all of these impulses to write positive criticism, what gets lost in the process?
Yeah, I think at a really basic level, people should have a model for liking and disliking art. As a museum educator, I work at a museum. I really like to encourage students to tell me if they find a work of art like not compelling. I'm like, what was your favorite? What was your least favorite? Like, do you hate Rembrandt? Like, I'd love to hear that. If so, I think that my piece, I'm thinking specifically about the kind of criticism that Black artists receive. And I think, one of the things that is happening is that because we are in a moment that has placed a lot of pressure on cultural consumption. This moment might be ending, but, for the past, 8, 9, 10 years, works of art have been called upon to perform a political role that they can't really necessarily fulfill. Institutions, critics, the art interpretation apparatus assigns political value to works of art, especially by artists of color, especially by Black artists, calls upon those works to be political. And then I think people get disenchanted when they feel or sense that the works of art can't actually do that. And then there's kind of like a wholesale disenchantment with art and art making. If you're being told like this work of art has this political impact, has this political power, and then somehow you can't agree with that, or that doesn't resonate with you, and in many ways it can't resonate with you. A work of art does not have a political power in the way that claims are being made for it. And so I think that those are the types of positive assessments, positive send-ups that say the work of art is important, that say it's timely, that say it's urgent, that are functioning for me as reviews that feel bad in some ways, because they're asking something of the object that it can't necessarily fulfill. And I think that is bad for artists, bad for audiences, and bad for viewers too, I guess.
And to just put an explicit point on that, what you mean by a political role that they can't fulfill is like a vision of representational politics that is actually functionally changing the world, right? It's like the discourse of representational politics is like, if we represent, everything will get better. And there's been sort of a utopian vision around that. And obviously representation is very important. And I think we're not disparaging the notion of the significance of representation, but also trying to acknowledge specifically that there's a limit to the power of representation, and then afterwards, other kinds of politics need to step in and push that idea forward. And instead, we're kind of getting stuck culturally in this moment around the vision of representation as the end-all, be-all of this discourse.
Yeah, and it's in the absence of those other political formations, political organizations, that this kind of discourse and that these kind of pressures on art and cultural consumption emerge, like in which the work of art was asked to redeem its viewers, redeem its audiences, it's the institutions that show it, the buyers that purchase it, and it can't do all those things. And I think the discourse that emerged around works of art and these outsized claims provided a sort of fodder for what we're seeing now in the form of attacks on what people call identity art. I think these kind of reactionary takes on, there's too much art by people with marginalized identities, or like that's the only thing we're seeing. That, I think, is one of the responses to the outsize pressures that were being applied to art, and is a component of this kind of moment of reaction.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things that you're describing do exist in some form on the literary side. Certainly we have the same problem with sort of representational expectations from novels, and that novels are going to do something. They're going to change the world in some way, but one of the things that is different about the literary side is that there's a serious commercial component. It's less commercial than it might look for the books that we're talking about usually. In certain senses, right? It's like most people, even though lots more people are reading novels than going to galleries, most of those people are still not reading literary fiction. They're reading, Dragon Smut, which is fascinating to me for a number of reasons. But there is this. There is a much, in that sense, the expectation for the novel in general can be lower. Another one of the big differences is that the New York Times Book Review exists, right? So it means I always have an antagonist, right? It means that there isn't, in other words, there is actually a sort of mainstream organ of kind of like of whatever kind of middlebrow literary taste, and that is, I don't even mean it as an insult. It's just like that's actually just what it is, right? And it produces sort of consensus where you like the same way that the New York Times cooking app produces consensus about what tastes good, right? There's just like everyone reads it because the Times said they should read it, and so they like it because and it doesn't mean the like is actually disingenuous. It's just it's a taste community, and so. And part of the way that the Times Book Review works, because they do review so many books, and they review them in such a timely fashion, that it's mostly novelists. It's mostly other novelists reviewing novels, and very rarely do they say anything meaningfully negative or meaningfully meaningful about those novels. Because why would they? Because why does it matter what's in the review? It matters that the review exists. It matters because it will become a bit for the paperback. They just sent me my paperback cover. I'm thinking about this, and realized that that's what happens. It's. We like to complain. The New York Times Book Review has had a bad reputation since the inception of the New York Times Book Review. You can read stuff in the 30s with people complaining about the Times Book Review. It's there to be complained about to some extent. But what makes that criticism bad is the fact that it reveals to those of us who know, and it's not necessarily that hard to become one of us. It reveals to those of us who know that the industry is an industry, and that when someone is giving a sort of nice, tepidly benevolent, account of the latest novel by whoever, that they are protecting their own professional interests, and that is, it's criticizable, but it is also, I think it has to be understood in the actual context of it. So in a sense, there is a kind of truth in that, because it feels crasser, that you don't find in the kind of work that you are talking about, Rachel, where there is this attempt to present a particular work of art as representing everyone in some identity group, or as a part of a project of liberation or freedom or democracy or whatever. Something about that obviously falls short. Whereas, kind of the parlor room chit chat of something like the Times Book Review really reminds you that there's a parlor room, and I can appreciate that in a way.
And to be fair, there are New York Times art critics as well, and there is an art section, so that also does exist.
But it wasn't run by Pamela Paul.
Maybe let's talk a little bit about the relationship to an audience as well when one's writing criticism, because I feel like another thing that we've talked about in the past a little bit about is like what responses one gets to criticism through what avenues, and also how internet reception can play into a willingness or unwillingness to write bad criticism. As Andrea, you have clearly professed, you go forth and in your own statement write what some consider to be bad criticism, and what I would assume many of you are here in the room because you consider to be good criticism. But I think you're also largely known to be someone who is a proliferator of the takedown form, or at least some claim this on, for instance, Twitter and elsewhere. And we were talking a little bit about how we feel that takedowns are much less of a thing in the art world in general, and we're curious, like, I think some of these material reasons play into that a lot. But there's also been some recent writing, I can't remember the author, but there was a piece in the New Yorker recently about why has music criticism gotten so nice. And one of the things that was cited in that piece was fandoms are very violent and will actually come for critics, and like, Swifties will actually threaten your life if you write a negative review of Taylor Swift. And so this conditions criticism in some way. And I'm curious to get into this idea of the takedown, and also to talk a little bit about public feedback and how that, does or does not condition the critical arena.
I mean, it would be deeply disingenuous for me to say that that I don't write with that in mind. I am, the first kind of extensive negative review I wrote was an adaptation of a Twitter thread. Like, I can't pretend that I don't think about it, and I don't tweet anymore as a rule. Sorry. But I do post the things, and then I do look at what people say, and I do usually know in advance the things that people are gonna quote when they put the tweet in their feed. I'm aware of that. That is that's what I want to happen. So, there is I would not want to conceal that part of the relationship at all. Nor would I want to say, like, yes, it's true. There's lots of professional reasons why people don't write bad criticism. There is a professional reason that I do. Like, it's not like I was just hired at New York Magazine because of that, and it's not like it's the only thing I do for the magazine. But it is part of it, right? So, like, in my case, it pays, and I know exactly how much. Like, that's a very real thing. What I do believe in about it, though, having established the crassness of it, is that one thing we have, and I'd be curious to hear about it on the art side, but we have a kind of celebrity around novelists and occasionally memoirists or poets that is a real kind of celebrity that is can be connected with a kind of influencing or with sort of professional talk giving, or there's a kind of public figure, and so I often, not always, but I am often writing about people who are public figures and have made being a public figure a part of who they are, and in those cases there is, I think, it is of interest to the common weal to actually try and figure out what these people are doing, because they are, they're the people who are enjoying the most. They're enjoying, some of the greatest benefits of a profession that most of whose practitioners do not enjoy those benefits. Most novelists are working novelists, like most actors are working actors, right? And it's not that's not the same thing as what's happening with with a Sally Rooney or with a Rachel Cusk or whoever, right? And part of how that, I think, ties in, just as a final point, to the question about kind of representation or identity, is that we end up soliciting, our most beautiful and incisive accounts of minority experience from people who fundamentally do not have that anymore, because they get six-figure book deals, and they can get $50,000 for coming to your college and answering a couple questions, right? You actually are having a minority experience, but it's not the one that you think you're having, and it doesn't mean that within that they're not still experiencing various forms of aggression or being made to feel that they don't belong, or whatever, right? It's more complicated than just one thing or another, but to some extent, those books end up being written by a very smaller set of people, and part of the reason that some of those people, some of those novelists or other writers or entertainers or artists will object to the idea of having their work criticized, or will object to the idea that they are not, in fact, like carrying the spirit of Vietnam everywhere that they go. Is because they are actually doing an identity politics of being writers, right? Like their identity has become, I am an important writer, and so I pursue and protect the interests of important writers as a class. And that, I think, is really illuminating, to think that we're not dealing with is the bad identity politics savable against the right, against the reactionary liberals and whatever. It's that in many cases we're talking about identity politics in many different guises.
Yeah, I do not know exactly why like the takedown is such a rare phenomenon in the art world. I do know that when there is a piece that advances like a critical judgment, a negative critical judgment, it is received as like an event. And people feel the need to respond to it and address it, and often say that the judgment should not have been issued for whatever reason. I think that is because of, I mean, people have made much about the removal of judgment from art criticism, like the removal of like the yes, no, good, bad, up, down response. And I think, you know, part of what's happening is that criticism often wants to say not that art is good or bad, but to demonstrate that it is important, maybe to say that it's worth our time and attention, which is a really valuable goal because, you know, there are a lot of things working to convince us that art is not worth our time or attention, and that's obviously bad. But the idea of the importance, the power, the political significance, the representational power attached to art, something about the way that those have become part of the way we understand what art does, creates a situation where, you know, maybe the takedown format is not desirable. I mean, some questions that I have, you know, really been trying to think through and answer for myself personally is, you know, is every critical assessment of the work of a Black artist or another marginalized artist an act with political stakes? Like, is it or isn't it? Like, I would love to say that the answer is no. I think in a utopian scenario, the answer is no. But I think a lot of critics approach the act of criticism when it comes to, you know, Black artists, to name just one type of artist, it's an act with political stakes. And, you know, maybe it is. Maybe it especially is right now in the moment of, you know, wholesale attacks on art and culture, on Black history in America. And, you know, I would really like to be able to shape a situation where every appraisal of the work of a Black artist was not an act with political stakes attached to it. I don't know. And then like another question that like I think through from time to time is, you know, are we are ever prepared to hear a white critic issue a negative assessment of the work of a Black artist? I feel like this is really at the core of what I was trying to think through, and I was trying to think through if that is true, like what are the reasons that that might be true? And we've talked through some of those reasons already, but like that is, for me, at the core, it's a really significant barrier that has been created between art and its audiences. If that is true, if there is no world in which we're prepared to hear a judgment like that, then it shows something, I think, you know, quite serious about kind of the interplay or the connection between, you know, subjectivities that have been produced as different from one another. And so I think that is like really at the heart of like the question of like, you know, why aren't there takedowns in the art world? Like, why would it be, if someone like wrote about the work of like Simone Leigh and was like, this is bad, I don't like this, like, I think people would think that was crazy. Like, I think that would just be a scandal to some people. And it's like, you know, why is that the situation that we're in? So.
And to give one example, this is not even a white critic making a negative judgment of a Black artist, but a Black critic making a critical judgment of a Black artist, not to call out Seth Rodney, who's in the front row here, but recently wrote about Amy Sherald and got a lot of backlash for just delivering a critical writing about a painter and the painter's form and style, because this should be happening behind closed doors. Why would you say something negative about this painter? And that puts up this barrier to having an actual conversation about an artist's work and saying something that they might also find deeply valuable and might help them push their work to somewhere new or push them forward, which in the scheme of things is the ideal relationship between a critic and a writer, right? That a critic is giving an assessment and performing a role of a deeply invested and knowledgeable reader in a way that they're offering information that's ultimately valuable to the artist or the writer.
Yeah, I mean, at a basic level, criticism is like a model for encounter between maybe two people, between a person and an object, and I think there's lots of ways in which that encounter is being denied by the critical situation as it as it currently stands. So.
One of the things we were, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I wonder. I really liked the idea of like a model for encounter, because it does. So I like to cape a little bit for the wokesters, not because I think it is like, not because I treasure those responses, but because there's something interesting to me about, like, I think that person would say, yes, indeed, criticism is about an encounter, is a model for an encounter between two people, which is to say that there has to be an ethic of it. And I think that that's probably true. Like, I think that impulse is, that impulse to me is far superior, even in its most sort of rudimentary form, crassest form, is superior to the contemplative attitude. Like, is superior to the idea of like, well, there's no ethic, because then we're not doing criticism anymore. Then we're just doing moral philosophy, or we're doing logistics or something, right? That, like, I appreciate the impulse that says, hey, like, this is about me, right? Like, what you're doing is somehow about me. When a fan has that relationship to a singer or a writer or whatever, they're not wrong. They're not wrong, right? There's a real material relationship, an invisible string, as Taylor Swift might say.
Did she say that?
I'm so sorry. But that is what I'm saying, right? Is that and they're saying it's here. There is actually a string, right? It does, when something happens on that end, I feel it on my end. And that, as a basic intuition, we were talking a little bit about the dialectic before we came out here. And sort of where we might be in the dialectical spin cycle. And I think has the germ. That is a negation, right? That is saying, hold on, right? Like, there is a different reality, and as long as it remains just that negation, then we're not doing the dialectic, and we're not, something more that has to be made into something more than just how, I'm going to come to your house and shoot you because you said something mean about Taylor, right? We must hope. But there is a part of me that still prefers, I'm going to come to your house and shoot you because you said a mean thing about Taylor, to, well, let's just talk about the art, The first thing is acknowledging in a sort of hysterical way some kind of material reality.
So to follow up on the thread of the invisible string, one of the things we were talking about downstairs before we came up here was, why do you all care so much about bad criticism? This was Rachel's explicit question. Why are so many people showing up here today? Why do they care about this? And Andrea said, this seems like the most interesting thing we should talk about is why you are curious that everybody cares about this. And I think the best way to answer this question is by having you all ask your questions for us.
Incredible segue.
So we can know why you're here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and my lovely colleague Zach will come around with a microphone and hand it to you, so you may ask.
Is it on? We can only do down here.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm
sorry,
sorry for those
people.
upstairs.
Wow.
If you feel very
Sorry.
passionately, though,
my
and you are
gosh.
upstairs and have a question, you can yell, and I will repeat it for those on the live stream. So you're not actually
You
excluded.
have
Just run
equal
down here.
opportunity, but you will have to try harder.
It's like those equality boxes meme.
If you don't have questions, we can speculate on why you're here, but I'd much rather
Gesture.
hear from you all.
Okay, I have a question. A question, which is kind of broad, but I think one distinction between, say, art criticism and music criticism versus literary criticism is that you can't you really can't make or break a career anymore with a bad review in the art world. I mean, the artists who make the biggest bucks routinely get panned by critics. And likewise, no amount of bad reviews is going to stop Taylor Swift. So whereas in the literary world, as far as I gather, a New York Times book review, a glowing New York Times book review can really, it's not the only way to make a bestseller, but it's still, a pan can really count for something. So I guess my broader question is, there's a lot of little takedown machines running on Instagram accounts, and there's the Manhattan Art Review, there's Diva Corp, writing really good impassioned takedowns for reasons that are unclear, right? Because they make no difference at all. So I was wondering if we go on the assumption that this discussion has been premised to an extent on this idea that there's some mysterious alignment that could be accomplished between an artist's aims and a critic's aims. But what if they're just their own things? If there is no alignment possible, why does criticism continue? Is it and I'm just wondering your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that we have these, you say takedown machines. That's exactly what they are. They're issuing negative judgment because they've perceived correctly that was a gap in the art world. As to art criticism, I think they have an inappropriately symbiotic relationship. I really do believe in criticism for criticism's sake. I think, there's a historic idea of the critic as the parasite, kind of the leech hanging off of the art world. But I actually believe that the practice of criticism does something different, or should do something different than the creation and then viewing of works of art, because I believe that art, when it offers itself as an object, gives the critic an opportunity to reveal something that is worth knowing that the object doesn't do or say on its own. I think art, it sounds a bit like I'm objectifying the object, or I'm making it a utilitarian thing, but I think that criticism is a pathway to understanding things about our society, about our history, that the object doesn't offer on its own. And so I think that, when there's just a feedback loop between the critic and the art world, or between the artist and the critic, that is really, honestly not criticism, which is why I think negative reviews for their own sake, and the kind of really ekphrastic send-ups that are kind of happening right now, where it's just kind of sometimes almost stream of consciousness, unadulterated flow of experience as offered up as a critical assessment, both don't really work for me, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree with, I think I would agree with basically all of that. I might put it as, what it says in the book is, okay, you can have art for art's sake, and then we'll have criticism for the sake of everything else, right? And I think that's a fair allotment. I would say I think they're completely different things. The whole critic as artist thing, I think, is sort of a nice, whatever. It's a nice idea, but it's not actually changing it's not really changing the math there. And I just think it's a practical activity in a way that art, if we are to believe that it exists, must not be. As Rachel just said, it has to tell you something, which art does not have to do, and that makes a world of difference. I like to say it's it's ultimately functional writing. If it's formally impressive or appealing, then great. But it's a table, right? It has more in common with a vacuum cleaner manual than it does with Hamlet, right? Because you need the vacuum cleaner manual in order to know how to use the vacuum, increasingly. And so, so I think it has to be functional, and that kind of, so I think of it as a craft and not as an art.
Another useful distinction, though, is often that art criticism is serving as historical record in many cases, and or an access to an object, experience, or encounter, particularly with ephemeral work like performance or, social practice, something like that. That's never happening with a novel, right? 99% of the time, the novel is going to be accessible to an audience, and they can go get the novel and have that in their home and lie in bed with it and read it. Whereas that's not usually an experience you can have with an artwork. You cannot usually lie in bed with an artwork unless you are above a certain level of wealth access or are an artist itself or have artist friends or such. And so I think, art criticism has this added burden of often serving as a historical record or giving an audience access to work that they might not otherwise have access to. I think we have time for one more question. I think this person in the middle back here. If other people who have questions, just come up and talk to us in the break.
Hi, so this is pretty much like a follow-up question to some of the conversations that's already currently happening. But I saw a show recently in Vietnam, and I really wanted to pitch a review for the show. And I was just thinking about how the conditions, it's not just the content, but the way that it was set up was actually, the poor conditions was actually affecting the way the art was presented. And so I was thinking about how do I pitch this and say explicitly that I actually want to say something quite negative about the show and not simply for the idea, but the actual execution of it. And I was told quite explicitly from one of the main editors that, this is not our emphasis. We don't want to think about this because we want to think about how much effort was actually put into the art, how much effort we understand collectively goes into the type of production that this is, right? Whereas I do think even in a lot of novel writing, there is a lot of effort on the, in the actual industry, but it doesn't seem like the critical apparatus is in the same way succumbing to some of the same material conditions that would make sense in the art world or in the plastic arts. So I guess my big question is this: if we sort of assume that the baseline for criticism is that anybody could make criticism, as opposed to there always being a sort of gateway or sort of this entryway into what is possible for criticism, then can't we not think about the actual critical apparatus itself as a sort of compromised approach to thinking about how criticism works? Because it isn't actually that democratic.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about the medium, the setting in which works of art are transmitted to us. This is something that it can be much more obvious when you're looking at a work of art. The place it is usually pretty apparent to us. It's downtown, it's in MoMA, it's in some rich man's house. I think it's actually much harder for the literary critic to maybe reconstruct some of those conditions by which the novel or whatever arrives to us. I think, maybe in the art world, because of the relationship between publications and institutions, maybe there's sometimes a reluctance to think about things like curation, strategy, and to take that as the object of critique. But it certainly is a really important object to take for critique, and so too is the history of interpretation, if such a history exists. A problem in art criticism is because there's not a lot of art writing. Critics are worried that the thing that they write might be one of the only things that ever gets written about a piece of work, and that's a sad situation because there really should be more. But yeah, I like to think of those kind of things as being within and even being produced by the object, and the object, something about it has caused it to be seen in a certain setting. Something about its qualities has yielded certain strategies of curation. So those are, I think, they're not external to the object at all.
Also, I feel like we all know that effort does not equal good choices or quality, right? This is a truth, and in fact, it seems like a gift that you would be offering to say you've spent all of this effort in a weird way that did not accomplish the thing that you were seemingly aiming for. That is as someone who long ago went to art school and was spending a lot of effort in the wrong ways and then realized I should be doing something else. Like, I think that's a helpful thing to hear, because then maybe you can spend that effort doing something else. And, you know, you only have so much time and energy and, as you say, resources, materials, things like that. Like, this is actually the gift that the critic has to offer when you're offering good critique, which considers, you know, a general sense of the material conditions as well as what people are trying to accomplish with the work.
Yeah, I think, and just to that point about criticism is not actually being that democratic after all. I think it's really worth dwelling on a little bit, because there is this kind of purportedly democratic ethos that is being kind of proposed by the critic as, like, you know, we are all going to be part of this sense community, and we're going to be able to, you know, think whatever. We're going to be able to talk about the best of whatever has been thought and said, or whatever the Matthew Arnold quote is, right? That this is going to be the, you know, a great exercise of intellect that happens in public and it is for everyone's own good. And I was reading, as I do not recommend you do, Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind for work. And I mean, it's actually very interesting because it sort of is, you know, kind of one of the, like, examples of this particular kind of anti, you know, kind of changes on campus books. But he has this very interesting remark about how when the founders promoted freedom of expression, it was because they wanted to make sure that intellectuals and scientists would have freedom of expression, and the only way to do that is to let everyone else have it too. So right, and it's so revealing. Of course, Bloom is like, and yes. But it's very revealing, is to say that you know, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, is for a small few a privilege, and for everyone else the price of the first group's freedom.
Thank you both so much. I think we have to wrap up. To do so, I'm going to do an uncomfortable thing and quote Andrea to her. But if you have not read Criticism in a Crisis or read Authority, I recommend it. And in Authority, you actually do describe why you think criticism is bad. And you say, bad criticism is bad not because it has been deflowered by political ideology, but for all of the typical reasons that writing is bad. It is poorly paid, hastily edited, and written mostly by freelancers with so little in the way of financial security, development opportunities, or access to good health care that they may go their entire careers without finding out whether or not they are genuinely untalented. Here is some better advice. Pay people. If we really want a critical mass of critics, then we will have to substantially improve the economic reality of being a critic in this country. And so, to our questioner's point, of course anyone can pick up a pen and write criticism, but it's something else altogether to have mentorship, to have opportunities to hone your voice in dialogue with others, to get to actually spend your time in a paid manner to read things. And so I think even if you're not buying expensive materials, the material conditions still impact the sort of conditions of a critic and the condition of criticism more broadly today. But thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you all for being here and preparing.